welcome to the Urbe ad Astra podcast, episode 7, Writing the Near Future with science fiction writer Naomi Kritzer. This episode is brought to you by Perhaps the Stars, the fourth and final novel in Ada Palmer's Terra Ignota series, available now in the UK and in the US on November the 2nd, wherever fine books are sold.
Hello! Welcome to the Urbe podcast, where we talk about the craft of writing, history, science fiction, fantasy, science, and other nifty topics.
Hello, I'm Jo Walton, science fiction and fantasy writer and vocateur reader.
And I'm Ada Palmer, also an SF novelist and a historian of European thought, censorship, books, the Renaissance, and weird claims people make about the printing press that aren't quite true.
And today we're going to talk about craft of writing and setting fiction in the future with our awesome friend Naomi Kritzer.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us. Do you want to give a little introduction to yourself for people who know less about you than we do, other than that you have amazing stories and books?
I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer. I've been publishing fiction for about the last 20 years. I live in St. Paul, Minnesota, and
And think a lot about ways to describe the future.
Yes. Oh, and I have a new book out called Chaos on CatNet that just came out back in April.
Yes, Chaos on CatNet, yes. Very, very exciting. Also, I really like its cover.
It's a nice cover. My kids both said they liked this cover better than the first book's cover, so I thought the first book's cover was pretty good too. So
my bar for covers is intentionally very low, because I know you have no power over them. So when my first book was not yet out, I came up with what I thought would be the worst possible cover, and then my friends rendered it for me in terrible CG, and then I printed it out and made it be a mouse pad, and then I knew that whatever the cover was, it would be better than that, even if it was like a photo of somebody's abs against fire.
One of my books that came out in the early 2000s has a photograph of a naked woman from the back. Mm-hmm. And when they sent me, it's not a bad cover exactly.
Yes,
it's just... But when they sent me the cover through the mail, I took it out of the envelope and I said, oh my God, they gave me one of Jacqueline Carey's covers by mistake. Because all she needs is that little tattoo on her lower back or hip or wherever it is on those covers. Mm-hmm. Jacqueline Carey's books were extremely popular at the time, so I do think they were trying to market it as something that her fans would like, which was terrible marketing because my book had no sex in it at all. That book was completely devoid of sex. And also, that scene, because you can tell which scene it is if you read the book, which is kind of cool, like you can identify what's happening. But that scene is taking place in Central Asia in January, so no one is going to be like sitting around without, she's probably wearing multiple layers of heavy wool and fur and things like that because it's so freaking cold. But anyway, covers. What do you do?
I love those books, but I love your new CatNet books even more. But I haven't actually seen the covers of the CatNet books because I got them on the Kindle and I haven't looked at the covers, so I don't know whether they're any good or not. But I've certainly seen the naked woman's back cover.
Yeah.
Now I'm imagining a cover where it does have the multiple layers of being swaddled in puffy cold gear, but then they're like transparent and you see the naked person underneath so that it can be accurate and naked at the same time. That would be an amazing book cover. We were going to talk about craft of writing in general, but in particular, we were going to talk about describing the future. Jo, why don't you give us a sense of narrowing on that? Because I know it can sound broad, but we have a plan.
Well, science fiction generally is set in the future, even if it's set tomorrow.
Yeah.
Because it can be, this exact world, but then something. And it needs interesting techniques to make it clear that it's the future and things have changed and how much they've changed and where the lines are from here to there. And when you don't spell it out, but you just imply it. And a thing that I found interesting in the CatNet books is that I don't think you ever say anywhere exactly what year it is.
No, I don't.
So it's sort of maybe 10 years in the future?
That's sort of my thought. I mean, the actual, do you remember there was a TV show back in the 80s called Max Headroom? That every episode at the beginning, there would be a little tagline that said 15 minutes into the future. Or it was either 10, 15, or 20. I don't remember exactly how many, but it's like just this brief period into the future. And of course, Max Headroom had had artificial intelligence, and it had this massively dystopic society and just a lot of other stuff that made it clear that it was further into the future than that. But that was sort of what I was thinking of when I was, thinking about how to portray the future. I wanted it to feel really soon, but not quite now.
Mm-hmm.
So there's robots and there's self-driving cars. When I was working on it, they were a lot more optimistic about how quickly we would have self-driving cars than they are now. It's kind of funny how much changed just in a couple of years in terms of what they're like, the time frame they were predicting for that particular bit of technology that I included.
Well, I think the thing that achieves and the 15 minutes in the future, and a sense that it captures, and I think CatNet does too, is the feeling of this being the kind of near future in which we're going to inevitably plunge, because one of the characteristics of our present is the knowledge that another inevitably disruptive tech, or probably 5 inevitably disruptive techs, are about to materialize in the same way that social media materialized and changed things, and communications technologies arrived and changed things. And so it gives a very good sense of being in this same phase of new disruptive techs are constantly arriving, like the disruptive techs that have arrived recently, but that we aren't at a different stage in technological advancement where we're concentrating on living on the moon or something that is sort of a different phase of interfacing with technology. We're interfacing with technology and its new disruptions the way we are in the present, even if the tech is new.
That's a good way to put it. I don't think I thought about it in those terms, but that's actually a really good way of, and I think that's often inevitable in near future. Near future science fiction is going to tend to feel kind of like the present, in the sense that like there's a lot going on that's hard to get our heads around. We're kind of overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
And your future is going to have that feeling, or else it's not going to feel authentic, because you're going to be like, how are these people 5 years from now, like, got so much more of a handle on things than I do? That just doesn't feel right to anybody.
Right. Well, particularly because we've been in a constant sequence of disruptive tech for the lived experience of everybody who's currently alive.
Yes.
But if you compare that with, for example, the Star Trek future doesn't feel like a future which is constantly, desperately coping with disruptive tech. It feels like a future that's very on top of its tech, and new technologies are developed as parts of stories, but none of them, you don't go home and the news is full of, economic disruptions due to the new thing that happened. Everything is at a calm tech level in which new inventions are arriving, but not disrupting, except in an immediate, that particular plot point way.
Yeah, this is true. Although one of the things that always, frustrates me about that style of science fiction is that often they won't act like something's disruptive when it should be.
Mm-hmm. The second order consequences won't be there.
They never show up.
Yeah.
I always love it when they do.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Because so often they don't. And so, like in Lois McMaster Bujold's Vorkosigan books, in the very first book, there's a new piece of military technology, and it's a big surprise. And then there are books that are set 20 years after, where that is kind of completely old hat. And it's sort of, been entirely assimilated and isn't useful anymore. And it's just very nice when you do see that kind of thing.
You're making me think of it's not quite a science fictional example, but there's a manga translated in English as Otherworldly Izakaya Nobu, and it's a food manga where there's a portal from modern Japan to generically vaguely German medieval fantasy planet, and the people who find the portal decide the correct thing to do is go through and open a Japanese pub and cook Japanese pub food for the wretchedly unhappy medieval peasants who absolutely love this amazing food and are constantly gushing about, oh my god, how did you have a chicken that was this big and this fat and in winter and how you have lettuce at this time of year and so on. And it's primarily, so that you can have lovely discussions of how pub food is made. But a couple volumes in, the tax assessor visits the town and goes to the restaurant, and not knowing what the source of this is, concludes that the town must have developed a whole bunch of new, better trade networks and gained prosperity if it has all of these rare and difficult to source ingredients. And it ends up having second-order consequences affecting the, regional tax system, and then the rumors get back to the imperial government, and then they start, planning a war differently because of this economic presence. It's exactly the kind of second-order consequence that's really fun for a tech, but that often doesn't develop.
One of the bits of useful feedback I got early on was to try to think through if, like, because there aren't any technologies that are only ever used for one thing. Any cool new technology is going to have multiple applications. And the advice I got was to try to make sure I didn't write the story where, like, we develop nanotechnology and use it only for medical purposes, never for military purposes.
Right.
Or all the many other things one could, there's a ton of things you could do with nanotechnology, ranging from, like, really cool to really horrifying. And, we would probably do most of them.
Well, and also, especially if we're near the present, so the economic structures are similar. So many technologies begin by targeting one particular market where they know they can sell often something high end and then use that to develop the rest. So for example, when we look at carbon nanofiber, which is now being used in lots of things, but when the companies were first developing it, what they knew they could sell it for was golf clubs and super lightweight bicycle frames.
Yeah.
And that those markets are high-end enough that they would support the development of the tech, which could then be used for all sorts of things, including medical and architectural and games and toys. And, my laptop is in a thing that claims to be made of carbon nanofiber to make it lighter weight. And so, thinking through those, which was the first use of the technology? Was the first use of the technology something marginal like that, where it's actually a small market but a wealthy one, or a very particular market? Was it funded by gaming first, and then they realized it could revolutionize public transit? Did it begin in sports and then move into whatever else it moved into?
Yeah, that's really neat.
So, Joe, you had proposed talking some about the challenges of describing the future. And when you were talking about that, I immediately thought of you're establishing your science fiction setting. It's the beginning of the story. Your character is walking across the street. And that is the moment at which you have to decide how much to describe of crossing the street, and how much you want to describe the street feeling a little bit like a normal mundane street, how many things you want to introduce that are science fictional or disruptive. And making that choice is very complex when you want it to feel like the future, the intentional amount toward the future. Because if you sit there and think carefully about your tech, you can then have developed so much that you could spend, 90 pages describing the things that the person sees on the street, which you don't want to do. You probably don't want to spend 90 paragraphs. You probably want to spend a couple of sentences. So if you're in a world that has, flying cars and nanotech and AI and anti-grav, but doesn't have teleportation, and, and you've worked all that out, how many of those things you choose to show that first time a character crosses the street, which is the moment when the reader who doesn't yet have an orientation in this story is trying to figure out how far in the future they are and how different that future is. And so there may be 30 texts you've worked out that the character would perceive while walking across the street, but you think, which one? If I'm only going to describe one, or maybe two that are briefly encountered, combined with which two normal, just like the regular world, non-futuristic things do you describe, that between them establish for the reader just enough for them to feel like they've gotten an orientation in, okay, this is a future about this different, about this far.
And also, a technique for doing that sometimes can be to describe something that is now really cutting edge as antique. Somebody drives by one of those antique Tesla cars, very well maintained, but it's sort of amazing there's still any of those around.
Right, or someone drives by in an antique Tesla car who did a great job concealing the cylinder of the stabilizer that prevents the lithium from exploding due to the anti-nuclear field that the enemy is bombarding us with.
Yes.
Which establishes about the same farness into the future, but a larger social disruption level than if the Tesla is straightforwardly maintained and driving along the road without an additional adaptation for a strange situation.
An example of this that I remember enjoying a lot when I read it is Scott Westerfield's Uglies, because the opening scene, to my recollection, you're at a party with a bunch of teenagers, and they like get wasted and then jump off the building, which is fine because they're all wearing these jackets that give you the anti-grav powers that are used for a bunch of the tech. But what it establishes really quickly is that like there are still teenagers and the teenagers still act like teenagers.
Yes.
But also there's some really cool technology and everyone is like, waiting for this like day when they will be old enough to have the magic surgery that makes them pretty.
Well, and also, the fact that this culture is safety conscious in the direction that would make sure everybody is wearing a system that automatically turns on anti-grav.
Yes.
But not in the way that they would implant something that breaks down the alcohol in your bloodstream so that you can't get drunk.
Right. Yeah.
Which, the fact that that is unchanged is also very informative. In addition to that teenagers still act like teenagers, that the society hasn't implemented the kind of controls that would do that is an anchoring detail that helps you orient of, okay, it's changed in these ways and not these other ways.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something about the 15 minutes in the future thing, to go back to that. One of the problems with that, you sort of touched on a tiny bit when you said we were going to have self-driving cars when you were doing the research for the book. It felt like we were going to have self-driving cars sooner than we actually are.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when you really are sort of surfing that cutting edge and pushing it into the future and setting it 20 minutes in the future, you've got the problem that when people read that book 10 years after it came out, it's already obsolete and obviously wrong, and it makes it less rereadable, or it makes it quaint in a sort of way. A lot of cyberpunk reads like that now.
Yeah.
Well, I remember you describing the example of the far future space explorer going into a dark abandoned spaceship and pulling out her cell phone and turning the screen white so that she could see by the light of it, rather than having a flashlight built in as every device does. And it, dates it very quickly in a conspicuous way.
Yeah, and there's Bruce Sterling's Islands in the Net, where somebody's got an amazing 24,000 modem, But even at the time I read that, like 4 or 5 years after the book came out, I already had a better modem than that. And now even the word modem is a little bit, old-fashioned. Sort of not the way that we think about connecting.
Yeah, all of which just makes the quite near future a really challenging sphere in which to write, in which you have to be very careful, and especially about which text you do describe, because sometimes it's possible to dodge describing a tech that isn't essential to what you're doing. So for example, if you have somebody walk up to the street and wave for a car and a car stops and picks them up and you don't specify whether or not there's a driver, then that story works whether or not self-driving cars have developed or taxis still exist. And similarly, if you talk about something having a incredibly fast information connection, but you don't give it a number in a metric that really exists and you don't call it a modem, then it can still work, and people sometimes will read and not even notice that it's not called a modem if modem still sounds right to them.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a wonderful scene in Heinlein's Citizen of the Galaxy where somebody is using a computer system connected to guns to shoot a pirate spaceship. And it's important to the plot that there's a port and a starboard computer connected to a gun, and that only one of them is working. And the other one is broken, so only one of them is working. And he doesn't describe the way in which it's broken. And I was rereading this book at some point, and I realised that when I'd first read it as a kid, I was just imagining this sort of like a computer, it's a super futuristic thing, I don't know what it is really, it's making the thing work. And then when I'd reread it, I had imagined these computers as the computer that I had at the time, the DOS computer, and I imagined it with wireframe graphics, like the computer game Elite. And when I was reading it then, 10 years ago, I was imagining that the way the computer was broken was a Windows blue screen of death.
Right, because your imagination can update it
Yeah,
every time, so long as the things that are described are not quite text specific
yeah.
when they don't need to be.
There's no description, so I could just keep on filling it in my mind.
Mm-hmm. And that means that the manner in which the computer is broken will always seem right to everyone.
Yes.
Whereas you could easily imagine an early computer age story where it's set in the year 2000 and the glass cylinders of the computer break and it doesn't make any sense. Or it could be, later and the operating system crashes. Well, there might be future things where that isn't the term we use for stuff like that. So that when you don't describe certain things strategically, it always looks right to the reader. Which doesn't just apply to tech, it applies to a lot of things. I think about that a lot when I'm doing character descriptions and visual descriptions of things. If you describe the shape of your spaceship, it can be cool if you have a neat idea for the shape of your spaceship. But if you don't have a neat idea for the shape of your spaceship, you can be vague and you could describe shining surfaces, or you can describe curves, and then the reader will fill in what's needed, and it will always look right to the reader because you didn't describe too much. But if you do have a really cool idea for what your spaceship looks like, and it looks like a brain with two squids sticking out the sides, and that is worth describing. But if the shape that you have is a sort of how you're envisioning a fairly generic, cool spaceship shape, you can watch that style thing evolve over time. Now I'm thinking of when Bill Higgins, who works at Fermilab, gives tours, and one of the neat things in Fermilab, which is a particle accelerator, is that as you walk through, you're walking from the oldest tech in it, from the earlier 20th century, and then you get to the mid-century tech and the later half the century tech, because they kept adding on to this facility and expanding it. And it's as if you're walking a chronological tour of science fiction book covers.
Yes.
And the very early thing is this shiny Lobe thing that really looks like the future looked in 1935. And then you get to the big banks of lots of switches, that sort of big beige banks with lots and lots of switches that sure look like the background of every movie about Apollo 11 or something that you've ever seen. And you keep going, and it is this tour of the aesthetics of what does a computer look like? What does a piece of technology look like? Which makes you realize that if you describe a roundy, lobey, shiny thing, you're going to be invoking that era. And if you describe whatever feels cool and normal to us in ways we don't necessarily realize is a aesthetic of our time, because one tends not to be conscious of the aesthetics of one's time, then 20 years from now, people will be able to recognize that as a 2020s science fictional image of the future, just like we can now recognize a 1930s one or a 1960s one.
The aesthetics of what looks future-y are pretty fascinating. And it's funny how quaint, 1980s era, future stuff looks now. The fonts are so evocative. There's very specific stuff. When I was a kid growing up in Wisconsin, there's a touristy area in Wisconsin called the Wisconsin Dells, which has a whole range of amusement parks and water parks and things like that. But one of the things that it had back in the 80s was this thing called Xanadu, the House of Tomorrow, which was this entirely white foam that had been extruded somehow into sort of domes. And when I saw it, it looked to me sort of like Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru's house in Star Wars was what what it reminded me of when I saw pictures of it. I never toured it, but there were ads for it all over. I saw, and I had friends who visited. And of course, it's long gone. At some point it closed, and then at some later point, it got just, disposed of as, no longer the House of Tomorrow, now yesterday's House of Tomorrow.
It'd be amazing to collect yesterday's House of Tomorrow's together.
Oh, that would be fascinating. It would make a great museum, honestly.
There's one in Wales in the Welsh Folk Museum where they've moved houses from all over Wales that are historical places that were going to be destroyed, and they've moved them all to this one location, and you can go and see them and tour them, and they've got them as they would have been at their dates. And they have a House of Tomorrow, which is a very 70s House of Tomorrow. And yeah, you can have a whole street of tomorrow where one was built every 25 years. It would be wonderful.
Yeah, and you could have the phase when there were, bright psychedelic colors in complicated shapes and everything is sliding away into modularness and, sort of the room looks empty except everything pops out of the wall. And then you move forward to the current houses of tomorrow are very dominated by green tech and have solar roofs and lots of white and green and live plants and glass. You can really kind of date House of Tomorrows by sight.
Yeah.
Which means similarly that when you describe your architecture, you're invoking particular past tomorrows and also drawing on the vocabulary of your present. If you describe right now a house that has solar roof and lots of, green and plants growing inside and, hydroponics, it feels like, okay, this is developing out of our hope for a green eco-utopia. This is probably going to deal in some ways with climate change. Is this going to turn out to be what everyone is living in or just the elites while everyone else is parched in the destroyed, world we've made? But you've clearly established yourself within a particular genealogy of thinking about what are the problems the future is going to have. Whereas if you describe the sort of tight, modular, everything pops in and out of the wall, super efficient one, then you're in the future descended from the worries of the era that produced Soylent Green and was anxious about overpopulation being the destructive thing and compacted cities. How are we going to fit, millions into a small space? It's not just that the cities of the future have an aesthetic, but they're each designed to address the problems that particular moment thinks are the big problems. So they also can establish which are the dominant future problem themes of a narrative.
This is very true. Makes me think about how, people have speculated that the vampire trend in urban fantasy was caused by anxiety about HIV, and zombies are about anxiety about immigration or something like that.
Or that they both of those, I think, get reused for new anxieties at different points,
Yes.
in a way that House of the Future also gets used for anxieties, our anxieties about House of the Present and housing of the near future.
Well, the thing about housing, too, is that, houses don't turn over as quickly as, telephones and cars and things like that. You build a house, it's likely to be around for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So even if one character is living in the house of the future, somebody else can be living in a house built in 1950, and it probably won't feel too out of place unless we're talking about a novel set centuries and centuries out.
Well, you're both 100% right, and that isn't actually done very often.
Yeah.
Because there's so much focus on House of the Future, architecture of the future, the future thing. There isn't very much layering and residual presence of mundane things from the present or recent past depicted in science fiction, so that it's striking and unusual when you see layers in things like the works of Gene Wolfe. I remember I was invited by the X Prize Foundation to be part of a discussion with a bunch of other science fiction writers about the future of architecture. And the X Prize Foundation wants to incentivize a technological something that will revolutionize housing. And their aim was 2030, something that will revolutionize housing by 2030. And there were several dozen science fiction writers on the discussion. And I was the only person who said most of the buildings people live in 2030 have already been built.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be talking about, if you want to revolutionize the majority of buildings by 2030, you're not talking about a building material or a building method or a integration into new buildings. You're talking about something that would revolutionize the use of old buildings, which is why I proposed wearable climate control, wearable air conditioning and heating, which enables you to live in any building but not worry about the heating and cooling needs of it, which applies to both new and old stuff. But it was very striking to me how amid a large number of people who spend their time professionally thinking about the future, everyone was thinking about House of the Future, new houses, what do we build into new houses, which I think is such an archetype that we think about it, and it's distinct when layers occur in science fiction. It's uncommon, and it's often characteristic of certain types of SF, cyberpunk being one of them. Cyberpunk has stuff.
Yes.
Unlike many science fiction futures, which don't have stuff. They have clean surfaces and screens.
Yeah, they are written on a clean page.
Mhm.
Everything has been tidied away. It is not messy. There's a lot of that.
Yeah. But that's another one of the things, returning to the, it's the beginning of the story, and we're helping to establish this world for the reader by having the character briefly cross the street. The presence of that antique Tesla establishes something about chronology and culture and hobbies being a thing that exists. So would the presence of stuff, right? So would a clutter of street carts, or a pile of trash, or a robot sweeping up a pile of trash, or a whole line of robots on their way to work cluttering the street and getting in the way, is a very different mood setter from a mostly empty street.
Mm-hmm.
And can sort of put your reader in, okay, this is this style of story. If you describe wires and neon lights, the reader is pretty confident we're going in a cyberpunk direction, even if nothing else cyberpunky has been mentioned, just from the landscape aesthetic of walking across the street.
This is true. I mean, there are a lot of, one of the useful things about tropes is that you can use them to sort of set the scene and tell people what sort of story to expect and what sort of future we're in and so on, just by like leaning heavily on certain tropes and the way they manage expectations. Like if you're kicking off a cyberpunk story, it's going to have a different feel from bright, shiny,
clean surfaces.
Yeah. Or, noir has its own like visual language when people describe the setup.
And these are great tools for establishing things quickly. They do a lot of work fast. So that you can pack more into a short story, or you can move more quickly into the plot of a novel or a series, because you can do a whole chunk of your world building with the aesthetic, even while you're also describing the antique Tesla, which establishes your chronology. If the neon lights are reflecting off of the polished surface of the antique Tesla, which stands out like a gem against the grungy street. We've done a lot of genre setting work, as well as temporal setting work, even though all we've done is describe a car sitting in a street. And all we've done is with one sentence, in fact.
I was thinking about that a couple of years ago when I was in Florence, and I was walking along by the Ponte Vecchio, so you've got this sort of amazing, fascinating Renaissance bridge, and there are little stalls along there that are selling things, but they're not selling medieval things, they're selling selfie sticks and adapters, so you can charge your devices. And that thing against that background suddenly becomes a piece of world building in an interesting way.
You could do the same thing by having people gathered in a restored shopping mall where people are, having a period, themed dinner of hot dogs and Twizzlers and, another inappropriate food that doesn't go with them, cheesesteaks, while vendors are walking along with their orbs and people who have a keto wand are coming and acquiring new colors from the wands as they pass, establishing again that layering and some juxtaposition of jumping in time, that you've gone far enough that going to a shopping mall is like going to a medieval times restaurant, and people are slightly wrong about what foods would be served on a plate. And yet there are still street vendors selling junk in a way that feels the same. So just like our teenagers are still drunk, but they have anti-grav, it's giving you both a grounding in, people still go to themed dinners when they're tourists, but it's also giving you how much the tech has advanced for the present to now be one of those themed dinners.
I'm now imagining a 20th century Renaissance festival equivalent, so like people in several hundred years from now setting up a fake 20th century with shrinky dinks and
you can ride a car around in a little circle, and there would be a gas station, and people dressed in skimpy versions of of clothing that is somewhere between like 80s super pink, neon
Yeah, the neon.
pink with fluffy hair, but also have like some goth spikes on there that don't quite add up.
That don't match.
And a hippie wig.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's all 20th century. Like, of course it all goes together.
Yeah, and what other activities would there be at the 20th Century Renaissance Festival? Well, there would be office cubicles. I bet that's a thing that it would be set up for fun. Like they might have a maze, but it's office cubicles, and you can wander through it and get to the other side and get a prize if you get it in a certain amount of time.
I was thinking Pac-Man, but like it'd be like an activity for little kids, and they'd run around in costumes being Pac-Man or the ghosts.
I wonder whether individual arcade game consoles or pinball machines would still be both so iconically 20th century and so profitable and easy to just set up there that those might persist as a 20th century thing you would visit.
I was thinking that you'd have, sit-ins or happenings from the 60s kind of thing, but also you'd have a sort of soundtrack that would go from rock music to 1920s music to having air raid sirens.
Yeah,
and you would have people in a mix of military uniforms that don't make any sense together, both among the performers and among the people who were attending in costume. And now imagine if we were writing a story that was set in this, the things people are wrong about and the things people are still right about tells us a lot about the future we're set in. So let's imagine that this is the first scene of a book, and it's taking place in the 20th Century Reenactment Renaissance Festival. And the stuff relating to one country or perhaps one language group is way more accurate, and the people clearly have it more clearly sorted out in their minds than the other stuff. Right, and they're really conflating different bits of, say, the Anglosphere, British and American military uniforms from all different stuff. But they clearly know that the Vietnam War is a particular thing, and they clearly know the sort of East Asian parts of the war, so that they don't mistake those wars, China, Vietnam, the Japanese and Chinese end of World War II, they have like clearly differentiated as separate booths and separate areas that you visit, but the other ones are all kind of a blur. That tells you what cultural roots we're descending from, right? And so would the inverse. Much as the inverse, in fact, kind of does at Renaissance festivals, where people tend to have a better sense of England's medieval period being different from England's Renaissance period than they do of other regions' medieval versus Renaissance periods, at least in an Anglophone Renfest.
Yeah, I will say that when I started working on the CatNet novels, I just sort of accepted that they were going to become dated. I mean, that's sort of inevitable with near future. Even if you think you're being very clever, there's almost certainly going to be something that you did not foresee becoming obsolete as quickly as it did. So I just tried to avoid the problem of writing about something that's obsolete already, and didn't worry too much about, the problem of like, I thought this thing wouldn't be obsolete, or I thought this thing wouldn't, would come along faster than it did, and just didn't sweat it that much, because it's a recipe for driving yourself crazy if you try to write a book that's going to be functional for all time.
Yeah.
With science fiction, it's really, really hard.
You've reminded me of another interesting challenge with working medium futurely, which is that sometimes there will be a technology, and a discovery has just been announced. Something that is exciting. Nanofiber, CRISPR, some wearable tech breakthrough, the moment Google Glass came out, some innovation in wearables. And it won't be widely disseminated. It'll be a floor model somewhere in a lab that nobody is using, Banta Black. But a discourse will develop so that people have a sense of how quickly it's going to come. And this is similar to the self-driving cars thing with you. So you might enter a phase in which a story that doesn't have this tech all over the place feels implausible to readers. But then later there will be a new development in that tech, so it's clear that it's going to be slower and more expensive. And then a near future that does have it is going to feel implausible to your readers. And that change can happen very quickly, even between when you start writing a book or when you finish writing a book and a book comes out. And so one of the factors is also not just what is the tech, but how fast do people think this tech is going to spread? And how much do people know about this tech and how fast it's likely to spread or not? Which can sometimes be a challenge when you're establishing a future, especially if you've done a whole lot of research and your sense of how fast the tech is going to go or what it's going to do is different from the common understanding of it, so that people have an expectation and you have to work against that expectation.
Are you thinking about your books where you still have people only barely out in the solar system in 300 years?
I mean, certainly that's one of them. So Joe and I have discussed this a bit of, at different points in the last 60 years, there were different expectations as to how far out in space humanity would be at different points, right? And we're getting up on when original Star Trek is going to take place and have interstellar spaceships in the expectations of the period when it was made. But we've discovered space is sort of harder and slower than we thought, and there has been less of it. So that if you were writing in 1970 and you're describing 2020 and we aren't living on the moon, it felt wrong. But now, of course, we're not living on the moon. The moon is really hard and has microscopic razors that fly around and shred stuff. But it can be other things. I think wearables are a very good example. When Google Glass came out and people hadn't actually tried it yet and it was just a demo model in a window, there was a moment in which it felt like, everyone's going to be using wearables in 10 years. Or similarly, when Oculus Rift and the new VR headsets came out, there's the moment, okay, how quickly is everything going to switch over to being VR now that we finally have it? And we have already written a million stories about VR and everything being VR, and it feels like we're just going to have that soon. Oh, it makes like 2/3 of people super mega nauseated, and the things are heavy and uncomfortable, and even people who game are mostly preferring to still use screens and not VR. Maybe we're farther from the VR than it seemed like we were a year ago when the thing was not yet on the market. So you can have almost whiplash and how fast it seems like a tech that we're a hair's breadth from is going to disseminate. I think the ultimate example being the many decades of the 20th century during which we were so close to cold fusion. We were going to have cold fusion any minute. Cold fusion is definitely about to be the thing. It's going to be super outdated to have any fuel system that isn't cold fusion.
Yes.
And not anymore.
I call this nanotech is here again. And it's a form of, it can be a form of past shock, where it's the opposite of future shock, where because we've been reading about this stuff in science fiction, we're almost surprised we don't have it yet. And when it does come along, we're surprised that it's so slow and backwards. And I mean, one example of this is that the space shuttle was actually the first spacecraft to have an airlock. And that feels like, I can't believe that nothing before that had an airlock. An airlock? I mean, I've been reading about those since before I was born,
Well, and I think, popular expectation can swing. So I've been making a study recently of sensationalist articles about the idea that physical paper books are dying. And there are a lot of these articles, and they happen sort of in a wave every year because people click on them. People are interested in the question of whether physical paper books are dying. Spoiler, no, physical paper books aren't dying. And in fact, usually when you zoom into these articles, which I've been doing, and it's very interesting to do so, about half of them are actively funded by online predatory publishers that are trying to scare aspiring writers and get them to pay for expensive self-publishing services.
Oh, wow.
And then the other half are journalists who realize they can capitalize on this wave. But a whole lot of them turn out to actually be secretly propagandistically funded. And it's really neat when you see they'll quote a thing and they'll be like, a study shows reading is down. And you follow through the footnotes to the thing they've cited. And it's reading of adult nonfiction is down 1.5% among adults aged 21 to 55 in only America. And reading will be up in every other demographic. But they don't need to reflect that, so it'll be up among kids and up among retired people and up in every other genre and up in Asia and up in Africa and up in India and up in Australia. And nonetheless, they quote it as reading is down. The really cool one for that one was that there were 2 articles a year apart in the same journal, and they were both reading is down. And one of the pieces of data, when you followed it through all the footnotes, was reading of adult fiction is down 1% and reading of adult nonfiction is up. And the next year it was reading of adult nonfiction is down slightly and reading of adult fiction is up again. What we were actually seeing was the 2016 authoritarian wave and a lot of people buying nonfiction books about the different authoritarian movements that were happening in different elections and books about Brexit and books about Trump. And then they started reading fiction again the next year. And so fiction was down a tiny bit and then nonfiction was down a tiny bit. But there are people who are very sure that books are dying because of these articles. And for that kind of reader, a future where somebody has a physical book 10 years from now or 20 years from now can ring false. And if there were another big wave of those articles, which happens sometimes, if there were a really big wave of them next year, we could hit a moment when most of our readers expect there to be no physical paper books in near future fiction, or indeed far future fiction, because of a pure media thing without any actual technological change. And the same could be true of, gasoline-based cars versus electric cars versus solar panels on your house versus not having solar panels on your house because everything is going to be some other method. All of these things can fluctuate hugely without the technology actually changing and without the research that the writer has done on the technology giving you anything different about what seems plausible to you as someone with a greater degree of having spent time reading about the tech.
One of the things that I was thinking about in terms of sort of sussing out what's going to feel like a plausible technology to readers by the time a book comes out is the problem of trying to be a futurist, because I sometimes get asked questions that expect me to be a futurist, which I'm not. Mm-hmm. But there is a degree to which, as a science fiction writer, when you're looking at a new technology, hopefully you're thinking about why people would be really excited about it and why they would be really opposed to using it, and what the advantages and disadvantages are. For instance, I really love ebooks for traveling because I can bring a Kindle instead of the huge stack of physical books that I would need to keep me occupied for a week. Kindle takes up much less space. On the other hand, you can't loan ebooks unless something's been enabled, and then you can only loan them a very limited amount. Whereas a paper book, I can finish the paper book and I can hand it off to a friend who can then hand it off to another friend, and we can pass it along physically. I also find with paper books that if I'm trying to remember something from earlier in the book, I can flip back very easily to approximately where it was. Yeah. My brain has that information and I can flip it. And you can't do that with an ebook. So there's certain types of books that are really, really annoying to read as ebooks because you have to flip back a lot to remind yourself of who is this character, or what is this word that's being used here. With Google Glass, the thing I remember happening very quickly once they announced it was a lot of privacy concerns from people who were I don't ever want to interact with somebody wearing Google Glass. I remember people saying that if you went out with Google Glass, people should physically assault you because you're obviously trying to invade everyone else's privacy. And that's a piece that I think the science fiction writers see this stuff coming more often than technology journalists, which does not make us perfect prognosticators at all, but
yeah. Well, I think we're primed to try to think about the second order consequences of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think when a newspaper wants an article about a new tech, they mostly want an article about the first order consequences of stuff, right? They want an article about what does Google Glass let you do? They want an article about the new technology is killing the old one, and the new one has these features. They want an article about our medieval town now has a pub that has these foods. And it's the science fiction writer who it's our job to say, okay, we've brought in the self-garbage incinerating trash cans that have a little incinerator in the bottom that incinerate the garbage right where you are and sort its molecules in a complicated way and like suck in all the carbon. And then they walk to the corner and drop off the incinerated molecules in the correct bins. Okay, well, people are definitely going to want to race them, and people are definitely going to like name them and draw faces on them, and people are definitely going to use it as a murder weapon. How can we use it as a murder weapon?
My first thought was like, never mind the pig farm. That's how we're going to get rid of bodies from now on.
Yeah, a journalist's job is not that. Journalist's job is, what does it do? Is it shiny? Are we going to want to have people invest in this stock or not?
Yeah.
And so it's a different direction of training somebody to think, just like the difference between somebody who's trained to study a virus as a virologist and somebody who's trained to study a virus as the doctor who's going to be in the hospital with a person who has a virus. Study it differently and think about it differently. And so do science fiction writers and journalists when we're thinking about a new tech.
One of my favorite technology articles ever, this was journalism, but it was written by somebody about the problem of American soldiers anthropomorphizing the bomb-clearing robots.
Yes.
Because, these are robots made by the same company, I think, that makes the Roomba.
Mm-hmm.
They were used to clear minefields. And there's this soldier who, brought his, completely smashed up robot back to the depot to get it repaired, and they were like, I'll just give you a new one, and he was like, it won't be Scooby, I want Scooby back.
Mm-hmm.
And they discovered there were actually people who would risk human lives to retrieve their robot friends. And I was like, this is not a problem that can be solved with regulation. This is a problem that needs to be solved with mythology. You need to tell the soldiers that the robot's soul is stored on a chip that is backed up and can simply be downloaded into its new body. It's the same robot. It just has a new physical form. Or else you could say that they only get to go to Robot Valhalla if they give their lives.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, there's lots of options here, but just saying don't do that, it's silly, is a bad option. That is an option that ignores how humans work.
You can even actually make the robot upload, logs reliably and then actually upload it into the new thing so that it's true.
It's not a lie. Yeah, no, it's true. You could totally.
I love the line that this needs to be solved with mythology, though, because you're absolutely right. There's so many things that applies to. That's wonderful. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes logic is just not going to do it.
Well, and I think connecting that slightly in a triangulation way with the book issue, there are a number of things in our culture which are on the edge of mythology where they're a practice that just feels wrong. And I think anybody who's ever been clearing out books and had the realization this book has no value and should go in the garbage, and you just can't.
Yes.
You just can't.
Yeah.
There's something that's like about it. And people drop off books in a box on the front doorstep of a used bookshop like a kitten rather than throwing it away. When you transition to the ebook and it's a file and you're not holding in your hand a thing, how do people feel about that? How do we narrativize that? Is it easier for a person to delete an ebook file because you haven't physically gone through the act of putting the thing in the trash? That's also it's not mythology in one sense, but it's very much this feels viscerally wrong, this feels viscerally right element that affects the way people use a technology, affect their willingness to adapt to a new one, and affect how the introduction of a new technology will make a certain thing like the erasure of a book harder or easier in ways that are not just the tech, but are the feelings of people about objects.
That's very true. Deleting a file off my Kindle feels like I'm tidying up, and throwing away a book does not feel that way. And I mean, I have thrown away books because sometimes a book gets mildewed or it gets peed on by a cat or it's simply so completely just like the glue, cheap paperback, sometimes the glue disintegrates and all the pages are falling out. And especially if it's something that's easy to just replace if you want, if you want another copy, then, the obvious thing to do with the one that's falling to pieces is to throw it away. And it's still very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It's very,
no matter how rational the calculation is, it's still this is the correct thing to do. Why can't I let go?
Yes. Yes. I also delete things from my Kindle without worrying about it in the way that I worry if it's actually hurting a book.
Mhm.
But I also got my Kindle in the first place for travel, and I went on a trip with my son, and he took his Kindle, and I took 11 books. And, I can figure these things out. And I had it like that for quite a while, and then I was using it because it made my hands hurt less. And then one day I was looking things up in half a dozen books at once that were all on the Kindle, and I was in Chicago, and I had them all there, and I could look them up, all these things that I wanted, and I suddenly realised that I loved my Kindle. That it wasn't just a tool. It wasn't a sort of a book thing. It was a library. It was in my pocket. It was the record of everything that I'd read on it. It was right there, and I actually loved it. And that my emotional relationship with this object was sort of real and different. So that was kind of neat.
Well, and I've noticed, so I've got a first-gen Kindle that is ancient and won't turn on anymore. And I haven't been able to make myself get rid of it. It has bookness.
Yeah.
It has a cover that looks like a book.
Yes.
Yeah.
I keep being like, well, someday I'll figure out how to turn it on again, and
Yes.
I did throw away the one that I broke in half. I once broke a Kindle in half accidentally.
I got into an argument with an Orthodox Jewish friend as to whether the Kindle was making fire, whether you could use it on Shabbat or not. Because to me, the soul of the Kindle is a book, but to him, it's an electronic device and he shouldn't be using it. But I actually felt, no, spiritually, I actually had feelings about this.
Interesting. Well, I think it's spiritually a book to the degree that a light bulb is spiritually fire.
Yeah.
I can see that logic, but I can also see the other logic. Both logics are perfectly true,
Yes.
and both of these are in the extremely broad definition of mythology, which also includes the impulse that makes you bring your broken robot back from the battlefield, and the impulse that makes you have trouble putting a book in the trash. I found it extra interesting with the broken military robots that it was also happening to the big dog robots, which have no head.
Yeah.
They have 4 legs and a thing, and I think one of the reasons they made sure to not give it a head was that they wanted people to be willing to leave it on the battlefield, but people like doodle faces on them and stick heads on them and love them.
Did you see the thing ages ago where they had the demonstration of how it worked and somebody kicked it?
And you felt terrible. Don't kick the thing.
Exactly.
And it staggered just like a thing that had been kicked.
Yes.
Kicking isn't good for you.
Yes.
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 Which it isn't. And it's, it's similar to the moment in the 18th to 19th centuries when European culture realized that normalizing violence to animals as a form of entertainment was bad for society morally. And there's an interesting phase where there's a campaign and writings and lithographs trying to get people to not do things that we kind of find unimaginable, like that it was a normal, you can go out in the street as a kid and play hopscotch or tag, or you can play set a cat on fire. And when you read things from the period, you realize that it was very normal to have these experiences of recreational violence to a stray dog or stray cat. And there's the moment of realizing that that also encourages other forms of violence, and so the culture pushed to denormalize that. But similarly, I think we're all very viscerally aware that witnessing normal violence to a robot that imitates a dog, that staggers like a dog, and being told this is normal and okay, sort of reopens that door that they worked hard to close of kicking a dog and seeing it stagger like that should make you feel negative, as opposed to should make you laugh. And the fact that it makes us feel negative and makes us want to say, hey, couldn't you demo something that doesn't look like it's hurting the dog, is part of that impulse to say, actually, one of the things that has been positive in our society is denormalizing recreational animal violence.
This is making me think about the relationships that future people will have with their technology, the mythological and emotional relationships that they'll have, which science fiction has not been so much interested in as you would think it maybe should be.
Right. The question of, in your in your future where you have your techno wand and people are selling colors in orbs, when it's time to get a new orb, do you just drop your old orb in the trash? Or do you, have difficulty getting rid of your orb? Do people keep their old broken orb because they're fond of it? Are there places that piece back together your broken orb? If you see somebody who has an orb that's got like a crack in it and a patch and is clearly like an old cell phone that's got a lot of cracks in the screen, how do you feel about that person? Or do you get a new orb every year because this is a planned obsolescence tech?
In Tanith Lee's Drinking Sapphire Wine and Don't Bite the Sun duology, people can change bodies very easily and change what their bodies look like very easily, and they can have all the stuff that they want. But the central character has a little hovering anti-grav thing that looks like a bee that can carry things for her and is also a computer that she can upload things to. But the book was written in 1977, so it's not very computery computer. And everybody's got one of these things, and they look like different things, and hers is broken and keeps falling, but she doesn't want to replace it because she's fond of it. But this really stands out to me as an example because it's so rare.
Right. Well, and you can play around also with what things we would consider a thing you keep and not. So let's imagine a short story in which we've got a cargo spaceship and it's going across. We have cool descriptions of it and the engineer, cobbling the engine bits back when they're being weird, and it's made out of a neat sort of layers of paper-like neat stuff, and it has folds, and we've gotten a lot of description of the ship, and it went through a bit of a scrape and made it out, and they were clever, and then we dock, and then the big storage bins within it like have feet, and they stand up and they walk out of the ship into the destination, and then they crush the ship and toss it in the recycling bin and keep going with the walkie bins. And the walkie bins are the part that you keep, and the spaceship is disposable. You have this whiplash of, no, the spaceship is cool. It's what's on the cover of things. It can't be disposable, and that is a way of looking at these questions of which things do we get invested in? We get invested in objects within a narrative. We get invested in the robot. We get invested in the little bee companion. We get invested in the sword that the hero has. And, when well written, the moment at which the sword breaks or the sword is lost or the sword is given to another can be very powerful, and it can be the spaceship that is broken or lost or given to another. But if it's the walking bin that we're working on getting invested in, it's very weird and unexpected and different.
That's so neat. I want that story with the origami spaceship now.
The origami spaceship and the walking bins. Well, there actually is an anime called Shingu, which effectively has origami giant robots. And they're so Japanese that, like, you get in your origami giant robot and you go in space to fight the space aliens, and you defeat the space aliens, and then cherry blossom petals blow past you in space, because that's how Japanese this wonderful thing. And then you go home to your wholesome Japanese village. It's actually a really fascinating series because it's in a lot of ways deconstructing and undermining mecha tropes, one being the hyper-technological and hyper-modern, why is the giant robot made out of metal from space? Or why is it made out of super high-tech things? Why isn't it made out of origami and a very complex method that you learn over time, but that uses earlier materials? And the series is also looking at, why do we always have our teenage protagonist who has to go fight in the giant robot be angsty and miserable? And so our teenage protagonist who has to fight in the giant origami robot has great parents who are just so supportive and amazing. And his dad is gone a lot because his dad works at the United Nations place that interfaces with aliens. But his dad calls and sends video messages and sends him a cool alien cell phone to share with his friends. And when his dad finally has time off work, he cooks them curry for dinner and is really sorry that he's been gone because of aliens. But, he just has such a wholesome idea. His friends friendships, and they like, come on, aliens, let's negotiate a truce, because tomorrow is the school festival, and all the parents and kids need to be able to go to the school festival. We don't want the ones who fight in the giant origami robots to have to miss class day because they'd be sad. And the aliens are like, yeah, that makes sense. We also want to go to the school festival. And it's a very interesting examination of both the why is the tech always aiming in one way, and why is the social fabric always one that leans toward isolation. Mecha leads toward isolation and sort of angst and misery and lack of support network, while it also leans toward heavy military, metal, and space tech. Why can't it lean toward family supportiveness, everyone coming together for something that is the defense of your planet? And why can't it lead toward technologies that are complex but old? The wide world of science fiction, it has lots and lots of strange things.
I read an interesting piece a year or two back about the sort of the trope in middle grade and YA where the parents are dead or entirely absent, that being the only way that you can get the kid out on the road and having an adventure without their parents getting in the way.
Yeah.
And this was a woman who I think was African American, although I could be misremembering that, but talking about how culturally specific it is, the idea that like parents would not trust their children or allow them autonomy. And how, in some cultures, like this person may have been talking about Moana, the movie Moana, where her mother knows that she's about to leave and lets her go and gives her blessing. And I was thinking about that in the context of the anime you're talking about, because the idea that these kids would have loving and supportive parents but still get to have adventures is very counter to a lot of the tropes we expect.
Well, the challenge of you want the kids to need to save the day. How do you have it be that the kids need to be the ones who save the day, and it's not that the parents fix it when they tell the parents there's a problem?
Yeah.
And a very easy answer is the parents are dead, or the parents are kidnapped, or the parents are evil. But there can be more complex answers, such as the parents are working at the United Nations doing diplomacy with the aliens. They're also helping, but there's a different task that the kids need to do. There's a very interesting science fiction anime that I think is a really good lens on this problem called Denocoil. And in that one, it's very near future, and it's very much interested in wearable tech direction. And the idea is that they've made a VR overlay reality, think Pokemon Go, so that you can have a cat that's not real, but everyone has a VR overlay. So when you look on the street, you see 3 cats going along, but 2 of the 3 cats are actually digital. And there are real cats, but there are also digital cats. And people use this for pets, but also for sending information to each other. But it's a fairly new tech. So like the kids are super into it, and a couple of the cool adults are into it, and the grandma is super into it, but the parents are just not interested in it. And then bugs develop within the VR reality that create sort of primitive life forms made out of code errors within this VR overlay. And the kids have to work to try to save those creatures from being destroyed by either other dangerous creatures or other threats to this computer overlay world. And it works really well because the parents just don't care. The parents just don't care about the computer overlay world. And the kids are like, but there's a life form-ish thing. It looks like a adorable, sad brontosaurus. and it's dying because the network is going out where it lives. And when they finish repairing the new line, it'll be gone. And the parents are like, yeah, but it's just a VR thing. It doesn't really exist. Yeah, but the grandma who does do the thing does care. And it does a really good job of the parents are there. The parents are even supportive, reasonable parents. But they haven't become invested in this VR world enough to care about the conflict within that VR world. Another way of solving the how do you have supportive present parents and yet the kid needs to be the one who saves the day.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a great and wide-ranging conversation, I think, showing how broad the craft of writing can flow when we think about SF. But now, by tradition, first, all of us will gush about books that we've been excited by lately. And then, at the end, there will be the administrative podcast required stuff.
But first, Naomi, where can listeners find more of your amazing stuff?
So they can find my 2 newer books, Catfishing on CatNet and Chaos on CatNet, at a bookstore near them. They can find my website at naomikritzer.com, and they can find me on Twitter as Naomi Kritzer.
So Joe, what's a book that you've been excited about lately?
Well, this afternoon I finished Ruth Anna Emrys's Half-Built Garden,
Ooh.
which is a science fiction novel that is coming out next year. It is about first contact and family in a sort of maybe 50 or 100-year future from now. It doesn't specify the exact year, but it is a book that I disagree with in a lot of ways at a lot of places, but it really made me think. And it's got a lot of things in it that you don't often see in science fiction, sort of in the ways that we've been talking about.
Cool. Naomi, what's a book or books that you've been excited about lately?
So I just read The Hidden Palace by Helene Wecker. She wrote a book called The Golem and the Genie that came out in 2013, and then this is the long-awaited sequel. It's a historical fantasy novel. It's set in early 20th century U.S. mostly. And the two characters are a djinn that was imprisoned by a sorcerer and a golem that was made and then accidentally freed because the person who was her master died suddenly while they were on the way to the U.S. And these two characters meet and bond and become friends. And then the first book is set over the course of just a few months. The second book is set over a much longer period. And it incorporates a lot of really interesting sort of 20th century, early 20th century actual historical events and places and, New York City, the New York City of the day. And it's gripping and the characters are lovely and I really enjoyed it.
Excellent. Ada, how about you?
I think at the moment, I've just been bonding with a friend, Emily Cambias, who we're going to have on this in another episode, talking about writing for teeny tiny young kids, because Emily works at Cricket Magazine. But we were discussing some of our favorite historical comic books, one of which is a sort of an odd and expected one, which is the Dark Age sequence in the middle of Kurt Busiek's Astra City. This is a comic that's a really intelligent commentary on superhero comics of the Marvel DC style. And in the earlier volumes, he does a brilliant job establishing a very familiar feeling world full of superheroes, where there's a recognizable corollary to Superman and corollary to Wonder Woman and so on. But we look at it from different POVs and asking different kinds of questions. So we'll look at it from the POV of the reporter or what are the standards of journalistic integrity when people teleport in and out of time and you're trying to report on this? Or how does the legal system get affected by people coming back from the dead all the time and is creating the evil clone defense and other legal problems? Or there's an amazing sequence where the equivalent of Superman and the equivalent of Wonder Woman sit down and discuss feminism and discuss the political activism that they try to work into their superheroic rescues of people. Exactly the kind of nerdy conversation that we have about such heroes. But then he does a dive back in time, and he goes through the second half of the 20th century looking at the cultural development of the US from World War II forward and then into darker, culturally darker eras from the POV of many Americans, such as Vietnam and Korea. And at the same time, there was in real comic book publishing a gradual loosening of censorship in that same phase, because censorship was at its peak in 1954. And so over the course of the moments when things like Korea and Vietnam were getting dark are also moments when superhero comics are getting dark. And so he weaves that together to make it be that there's a sort of a metaphysical superheroic threat that worsens along with both the development of US culture and the gradual darkening of what you could have in comics. And it creates a history of the degree of optimism or pessimism in US culture reflected through the degree of innocence or grittiness of the superheroes changing over time, and has amazing moments in it, one of which is actually early, so I don't mind it, but it works as a great example. There's a moment where there's a superhero called the Old Soldier, who no one knows where he comes from. He seems to be some kind of spirit, and he's this old veteran who's got bandanas, and he's got different weapons on him which seem to be from many different time periods, and he has a a pistol, but he also has Excalibur, and he clearly sort of seems to materialize out of time to help every time there's a terrible situation in a war. And in Vietnam, it's the first time America has found him fighting against their troops instead of with their troops, which they were so used to during World War II when he helped defeat the Nazis. And it causes this moment of super cultural trauma and questioning and, wait, what does it mean if the old soldier is fighting against us now, with this interesting superhero metaphysics underlying. So it's an amazing triple history of the US and of comic books and of comic book censorship, woven together into the negative space of how gritty the superheroes are allowed to be, and all told from the POV of some very minor figures who are not superheroes at all, and therefore have the what is it like to live in this world POV. Sorry, that was a very long explanation, but it's a very complex text.
Sounds great. Okay, this podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives International 4.0 license.
And you can support us and get episodes in advance at patreon.com/Ada Palmer, and you can support Jo and get her amazing poetry at patreon.com/BlueJo.
And you can find us on Twitter and our books and things at joewaltonbooks.com and adapalmer.com. So until next time, ex urbe ad astra.
Ad Astra.
Ad Astra.